Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last afternoon of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. This afternoon, we are pleased to welcome again Dr. Raul M. Abril from the European Commission. I'm just going to say that again because the live button just came on. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the afternoon of the last afternoon of the second Digital Transformation in Government Conference. We are pleased today to welcome again Dr. Raul Abril from the European Commission. And he's going to be talking to us on how to select a digital public service implementation orientation as basically client-facing, where they want to go, and how they've done it in a very complex institution such as the European Union. Now, Dr. Abril is an officer of the European Commission since 2013, and he's also at the same time a research fellow at the Université Leuven, the Public Governance Institute. He's responsible for a portfolio of European programs, including the European Interoperability Reference Architecture, more affectionately known as EIRA, the eGovernment Enterprise Reference Architecture, Portfolio Decision-Making Support, and the eGovernment Reference Architecture Digital Transformation Roadmap Support. He's got 35 years plus of IT professional services experience, most in the private sector. And he's held several senior positions, including R&D Portfolio Manager in a major USA vendor. He holds a doctoral degree from Henley, a European PhD, a certification from the European Doctoral School in Denmark, an ingénieur supérieur informatique, and also a master's in project management from George Washington University in the United States. So without further ado, and I'm looking very much forward to the presentation, Dr. Abril, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I just put my timer to try to help you with my time management. Thank you to everybody. Good morning and bonjour, good afternoon, sorry, with the time difference, and bonjour à tous. So I am going to ask you, Bob, for your help with the plan B, just to avoid any latency. So let's go to the next slide to see the agenda. This agenda basically is going to bring us through a journey that we have been discovering, if you allow me, in the European Commission, which is my institution. I am in the executive government, working with the colleagues in the member states. So, the title of how to select a digital public service implementation orientation, it requires some explanation. That is my challenge today for you. So let's go to the next slide, please. This is the introduction to basic concepts. So let's go to the next slide. Well, we are going to talk about basically digital public service. And what you have here is a schematic representation on who are the actors working. So we have businesses, we have citizens, and we have other administrations. And then those administrations, they have borders between themselves. And by borders, and every time that I will talk in this presentation about cross-border, don't think about the border of between Canada and US or between US and Mexico, okay? It may be the borders between two provinces, between two provinces in basically between two provinces in Canada, or between basically also the borders between two municipalities in the same border, okay, in the same country, sorry. And then what you have here is also another actor, which is the concept of supra, I would say, national, or the top tier level of administration. In the case of the European Union is us, the European Commission, but in the case of Canada, it could be the federal government in Ottawa, or in the case of US, could be the federal government. And those are the three types of interfaces. Next slide, please, Bob. And then what you have here are some examples just to position ourselves when we are talking about the digital public services. We are talking about this type of services, okay? Those are just examples, so, okay, there is no too much value here. Next slide, please. According to EIRA, the European Interoperability Reference Architecture, what we talk about digital or public services is in essence digital public services that are delivered through a digital service delivery mode. So that's something just for the sake of accuracy, to understand that when we talk about digital, we mean that the service delivery mode of the public service, either for consumption or provision, is through a digital way. Next slide, please. So, and this is a caveat type of a slide, because I find sometimes some confusion between integration and interoperability, and I would like to clarify, to be sure that we have this concept clear. No, and I wanted to use an example for some of you that, like me, that I loved music many years ago, in the years of for example, Led Zeppelin. I mean, what we liked to have, it was our musical equipment with different components. Okay, our speakers, our amplifier, of course, of bulbs, etc., etc. Well, all of them are interoperable, okay? And the idea here is that interoperability means that you have different components that they are basically operating and exchanging. And when we talk about integration, it means that you cannot disaggregate them. They are fully integrated. Below, in the second, in the bottom part of the slide, what you have is the same concept, but to data. You can see that, for your information, as Bob has introduced me, I have spent more than 15 years in a leader on data warehousing. So I have been doing a lot of my professional activity integrating. Well, now in the public administration, I am doing the other thing, and not doing the opposite, but trying to basically interoperate different separated data sources. So this is a clear example between the difference between integration and interoperability. Next slide, please. Well, this is an important slide, and what I wanted to, now that no one is listening to us again and that we are in family, let me share with you that to realize this slide took me between 3 and 4 years. And the importance of this slide is that the concept of interoperability is not complex, it's extremely complex. And then I found, talking to colleagues in member states, that the best way to explain or to introduce the concept of interoperability was starting the explanation by talking about the barriers of lack of interoperability. So in the left-hand side, what you have is a representation on the typical provision of a digital public services. Typically, they are delivered by an agent that can be a human agent or a machine agent, and then is acting on behalf of a principal, and this principal can be an administration, a business, or a citizen. And then this is operating in what we call a lost environment. It's an environment that is characterized by legal, organizational, semantic, and technology aspects, okay? And this digital public service has been implementing according to this type of 4 requirements. And nowadays, these digital public services requires to exchange business information with another digital public service that again is provisioned by another agent, human or machine, acting on behalf of another principal, but it has been implemented in another lost environment. So where is the barrier? Where are the challenges? The challenges is when there is a little change in just one aspect, in the L or in the O or in the S or in the T. And I should not say or, I should say or and. So when there is just a little change in this aspect, whatever it is, in this environment, then we have a barrier, which makes the exchange between those digital public service a problem. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is now where we define, and I would say these level of understanding about interoperability is, unfortunately, after 30 years working, very recent. I will say that we have reached this understanding in the last 3 to 2 years. I mean, interoperability is complex because it's a multidimensional construct. It has more than one dimension. Actually, it has 3 dimensions according to our proposition. And this is the result of research. I mean, a first dimension is we need to understand that we have a structural interoperability. And by structural interoperability, we understand how the digital public service has been designed. It's interoperability by design, no? Looking for the reusability of specifications, standards, or existing software components. And basically, the principle guiding that is that if you build up a digital public service with interoperable components, then at the end, you are enabling, but maybe you need to do more, the interoperability of the entire public service. This is the logic. Is that enough? No way, dear colleagues, because this black box, it needs to basically exchange, and we call that behavioral interoperability. So in behavioral interoperability, we care about the ability of this digital public service basically exchanging information. And is that enough? No way. Finally, we need, because it's not alone in the world, this exchange of information, it needs to be harmonized with other digital public services, typically in a peer-to-peer relationship. So we need a governance. A governance interoperability is the third dimension, and last dimension, by the way, where we need to have protocols, agreements that this information exchange is harmonized between the both digital public services. So as you can see, this is not easy to explain from the beginning, and to reach this level of understanding, it took us, I would say, around 25 years. At the bottom, you have the note to the place where this has been published. So again, interoperability is a dimensional construct, and when we need to talk about structural interoperability, behavioral interoperability, and governance interoperability. Next slide, Bob, please. Okay, so let's talk about requirements and architecture-driven requirements engineering. I mean, I am borrowing here a concept from the EDM of TOGAF, basically to illustrate that in this enterprise architecture framework, we could take another. If you want, we could go to the place to send, if you want, of Sackman. But okay, let's take the TOGAF from the open group, which I think is a good enterprise architecture framework, where they are putting basically what I would like you to focus. Requirements is in the center. So whatever you do, you need to be based on requirements. And then the middle icon is just a book that I find excellent, that there is a section, is a chapter that is talking about architecture-driven requirements engineering. In essence, saying that one of the roles, not the only one, as I commented in my presentation yesterday, but one of the roles of one architecture is to identify as a quality assurance tool what are the types of requirements that you need to have. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so according to EIRA, and this is just a partial view, there are some key interoperability enablers. Okay, so EIRA has many more. It's a pretty comprehensive, I would say, architecture focusing on how to several use cases. One of those is to design a digital public service. Another is to analyze the requirements of a digital public service. But what I wanted to illustrate in this slide is that we are addressing the 3 dimensions of interoperability that you have in those 3 columns. So you have the basically the structural dimension of interoperability. In the middle, you have the behavioral dimension of interoperability. And in the right-hand side, you have the governance, the governance dimensions of interoperability. And then we are in a lost environment, so we need to be achieving legal, organizational, and semantic and technology interoperability. And what you have in the middle of this square are the different architectural building blocks, which you could translate by requirements if you are going to design a to-be digital public services, so that you need to have in place. But notice those 4 IBBs that are to the left, that they share legal framework, they share governance framework, they share knowledge base, and they share platform. Those are really crucial for our presentation and the message that we want to say. So in essence, what we are saying is, if you want to build a digital public service which is interoperable, by the way, in the European Union, we cannot understand a digital public service that is not interoperable. You not only need to have a legislation catalog or a legislation on data or legal interoperability agreements and so on and so forth, is that you need to have that share between the different actors. Because if you don't have share, then you don't have interoperability. Next slide, please. Next slide, Bob. Okay, thank you. So in this slide, I am illustrating basically in the left-hand side a situation where we have, for example, a province, just focusing in Canada, if you allow me, that is working in a lost environment. So they have their legal organization, semantic and technology, and they have implemented a digital public service number 1 that is meeting the requirements from platform, technology, knowledge base, which means data, means information knowledge, which means governance framework and a legal framework. And then we have another digital public service in another province that is operating with another environment. And then we have this digital public service, which is fully functional in this province, but they are not interoperable because this network infrastructure, which is this horizontal line, which is supposed to be the way to exchange information between the digital public service, they can do nothing, okay, because they are not sharing anything. So we call this situation as share nothing. So there is no cross-border interoperability. So there are barriers between the technical, semantic, organizational, and legal perspectives. Next slide, please, Bob. So let's talk about the concept, very important concept of implementation orientation on the digital public service. So next slide, please. And to talk about that, I consider that was a kind of basically relevant to talk some different types of orientations that you may be aware. For example, in the business management literature, there is the concept of customer orientation. Basically, the focus is on customers and then aligning everything else to this orientation. Or for example, in project management or product management, the concept of user-centric design orientation means that you are really the design of the process or the project focuses on requirements, and then you are aligning everything to this. So for example, if you are in project management, you know, according to the best practices, that you have 3 variables that you need to take care: quality, schedule, and cost. So if you need to select one because you cannot do the 3 at the same time, so you may be, for example, quality oriented. So the schedule and the cost should be aligned. So this is the important concept about orientation. It requires a focus and it requires to align the alternative choices to this focus. Next slide, Bob, please. So what in digital public services, I was and we are interested, but I wanted to make also a caution here is I mean, maybe there are other implementation orientations, but so far we didn't find them. So we have identified four types of implementation orientations talking about digital public services. One is the technical, the other is integration, which means about data. Why I'm using the term integration and not data integration? Because it's what the literature says. Every time that in the literature on management information systems you talk about integration, is generally speaking talking about data integration. Then we have the governance integration, and then we have the legal implementation orientation. And basically, they have the same type of definition that in the examples that I said. You have a focus or anchor, if you want to, which is the entry point. That's why I put this symbol here, this icon of the entry. And then the other three alternatives should be aligned. It doesn't mean that we forget. No way. You need to do the four, but you need to decide what is your entry point and then to accommodate the other three alternatives. Next slide, please. All right, so let's start talking about implementation, no? So let's assume, because you need to start in some way, that we start with a technology type of orientation. Yesterday, I had the privilege to attend an excellent presentation of Julie in this conference. It was a really good presentation, and I would say modestly that this type of approach is what I am characterizing here, not necessarily in this slide, but in others, which is technology. No, so in this type of approach, what we are looking for is to implement a shared platform, which is basically a kind of supermarket, if you allow me the simplification, with shelves where you are putting in those shelves services in the digital sense, services and software components, and then you are putting them, and basically you are hoping, if you cannot impose them, of course, that they are going to be used by everybody. So in this illustration, what I am saying is that the P1, which is the platform for this, in this case, this province or this member state, has completely mirrored all of them by a shared, basically, platform that is common because it's shared through other provinces and also with the federal government. So in this case, the degree, the intensity of this implementation orientation is yes, it's a technology implementation orientation, and we characterize that as a perfect shared technology where there is a cross-border interoperability, so there is no interoperability barriers from the technology perspective. But by the way, it doesn't mean that there are no problems with the interoperability barriers with the legal aspect, with the governance aspect, or with the data. But at least from the technology perspective, there are not challenges. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's go to the reality, the real life. The previous one, the perfect, is difficult, or it takes a lot of time. The typical situation is that you have a variety of implementations, and then the shared part of the technology changes. Is different. So you may find a member state number one, or a province number one, or a regional government number one that is implemented some level of technology. And then we have another one which is implementing less in the middle. And then we have potentially in the federal government that is trying to be very exemplar and to be an example for everybody, implementing almost everything shared with respect to what they have internally. And we call that imperfect shared technology, which it means that there are some barriers, some even from the technology perspective. By the way, I didn't comment it, but notice that in the upper right hand, I am putting the radar and I'm talking about basically in the circle what I am talking about. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, Bob, and I will be very fast now. The same thing that I commented for the technology, you can say if your entry point is for what? Is for the basically your data. You can talk about perfect shared integration if this is the case. Go to the next slide, please. The same may happen about if you are focusing on governance with your shared governance framework. Next slide, please. And the same happen, and finally, if you do that with your legal framework, no, that this is your approach, no, in this case, this is the perfect shared legal approach. So next slide, please, Bob. So this is the target, dear colleagues. The target is to have a degree of perfect share everything. Here is where you have interoperability. Okay, so because you don't have any barriers for any perspective, technical, semantic, organizational, or legal. Okay, so this is our dream. This is that's what we need to work for, and this is extremely difficult. Okay, so next slide, please. So let's talk about Continuum digital transformation, not only digital transformation, but Continuum. Thank you, Bob. So in this slide, basically it says the complexity of the challenge that we are affording. Okay, in essence, is you choose whatever you are talking in the lower for example, in the lower right part, you have the legal framework. For example, if you are a member state or a province, you may start slowly doing some efforts to share some legal framework, and then you may decide with the time to move up to the upper right corner, for example, to share, as yesterday we saw, for example, to share a little bit about technology, and maybe you do several cycles. And this is what this recursive means. You may spend some cycles increasing the share platform part, and then when you feel comfortable, you may move to the left-hand side, for example, or you could move back down to the legal framework, or you could move to the left-hand side to say, okay, we should start integrating data, no? Why not? And then to try to share something. So basically here you have a comment of the complexity, but I want to make a comment here, and is on the recursive arrow on the legal, on the bottom right corner. This recursive legal, it may take many years. Why? Because if you create a legal test with some requirements, at least in the European Union, the average time of not touching a legal test is 5 years. So it means that changing the legal test, it may take some time. And this requires a lot of time. So what I'm trying to send the message here, dear colleagues, is to reach perfect share everything, it takes not months, many years. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the question. The question is, if we are in the left-hand side, which is share nothing, no cross-border interoperability, and our target is at the right-hand side, perfect share everything, cross-border interoperability, and in the middle we have this continuum, and I have several options because I have theoretically 4 entry points. What is my entry point? I mean, how do I decide that? This, I would say, presentation goes with a lot of love to my colleagues, which are CIOs or portfolio managers, as I was in the private sector. So it goes for everybody with a focus word, them, because you, the CIOs and portfolio managers, you should make a decision, right? And not arbitrarily. So where do you start? Next slide, please. But then, many times the way that you formulate your business questions is important because they may direct you in the wrong approach to the question. So we are proposing to change the previous formulation to this formulation. Is instead of talking about entry point, what we need to talk is about implementation orientation. And by the way, this is our recommendation, we are going to be modest, very modest. And we are not pretending to find the optimal implementation orientation. I would recommend that you accept our limitations And then we say, I will be happy if I am deciding what is the less bad implementation orientation. This is my recommendation in this continuum. Next slide, please. So now we need to talk about public policy, because we are in this presentation talking about public administration. And then this is a result of our research for 7 years that we have conducted. And you have at the bottom the paper that is going to be actually a chapter in a book, which is in printing. And then basically we need to understand that digital public service are in the context of a public policy. And how do we characterize this public policy? Well, according to our research, you have 2 dimensions, 2 variables. One is delegation of powers, that in essence means how this public, in terms of provision of digital public service, how centralized or decentralized is this basically public policy. But please don't be confused with the structure of the state. I am talking about with the public policy. I am not talking about if you are federal or very centralized as a state. For example, you can be in Canada, which is very decentralized country, and then you may have the public policy of defense, and I am almost sure that it will be very centralized. But however, the health public policy maybe will be very decentralized. The second dimension that we need to understand is regulatory state, which is a fancy word to make our life difficult. I apologize about that, but it's what is in the literature. Basically, by that means what is the level of granularity of requirements that are in the basically the legal test that this digital public service must fulfill. Okay, is this very granular or not? Let's go to the next slide. So what you have here is that depending on the streams, and yes, I know that there are gray areas, but in order to characterize, I have to focus on the stream values. So delegation of powers, provisioning of a public policy, provision a digital public service may be very centralized or delegated, including sharing. Okay, and then the regulatory state, which means again granularity of the requirements in legal tests, can be very high level requirements in the legal test, like recommendations, principles, etc., or very detailed requirements, like you need to use this standard, you need to use this form, you need to use this API, for example. Okay, so what we have are 4 combinations, which means 4 scenarios, which is the scenarios that they help us to characterize a public policy context. So we need to understand for a digital public service, what is the public policy context? So it means that for one digital public service in a public policy, it will be one scenario, but for another digital public service in another public policy, it will be different. And those are the 4 scenarios that I put in these labels, which are the subsidiarity scenario characterized by delegated delegation of powers in the provision of digital public service, but very high level abstract generic requirements. And then, for example, in the opposite, the integrated scenario, which is for a very centralized delegation of powers, but with a culture of putting a lot of detail, very specific requirements in the legal text. Next slide, please. So now let's go to our job as a implementation as portfolio managers. So the first step in trying to support this decision on what is the less bad orientation is to understand what are you doing today. And then we have this, I promise that I will not do any demo. This is the link to, if you want to play, it will be my pleasure. If there are portfolio managers and CEO here, again, I will repeat my offer like yesterday to support. But this is basically coming and asking you, where are you? What is your current implementation, if any, no? And then let's go to the next slide, please, Bob. And then those are actually examples of real examples of portfolio managers and CIOs responding. And then you can find this profile in the bottom, and the second. What I wanted, my question, my rhetoric question is there an implementation orientation? And the answer, dear colleagues, is no. Those colleagues responding in this way, they did not have an implementation orientation, because in the first one, in the bottom, they were saying that they are fully, their implementation orientation is both fully oriented through the platform and also to the governance. So they don't have one. And in the second one is same, more or less the same between the data integration and the technology. Next slide, please. And then here you have 3 examples of, yes, that they are having intendedly, or they believe they have an implementation orientation, because there is clearly one that everything else is behind them. No? So there is a difference between the other two. Next slide, please. So the next step basically here consists in understanding what is the context where that you are. Where is the context, the public policy context of your digital public service? So you need to position yourself in those 4 quadrants, one of those 4 quadrants. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. And then finally, and this is the last step, this is what the basically our research and this tool that I am putting, again, the link at the bottom, is telling you. So from the less bad implementation orientation is that if you are in the subsidiarity scenario, the less bad implementation orientation, the entry point that you should take, this is the recommendation, is the legal implementation. If you are in the federated scenario, the less bad implementation orientation that you should do is the technical implementation orientation. If you are in the integrated scenario, your approach should be the integration implementation orientation. And if you are in the statecraft scenario, the approach, the less bad implementation orientation that you should have is the governance implementation orientation. Next slide, please. By the way, I want to comment here that in the annexes, you have some explanations, some rationale, but I would admit that we need additional research. So far, I want to tell you that the previous slide we have tested successfully in this chapter that of this book that it is going to be published hopefully in a couple of months, and that we have tested that in 7 member states, okay, successfully, okay, and that we are open to get feedback, corrections, and to challenges. Why not? No. So what is the situation that this slide represents? Well, the situation is that in the left-hand side is what the previous slide says, that the scenario where you are, which is identified by the public policy context, is matching the orientation that you have. So you have to do nothing. However, if you are in the right-hand side, which means that you have, of course, a public policy context, but then the implementation orientation that you have is not matching this, then the recommendation is that you move to basically the other implementation orientation. Next slide, Bob, please. So why this is important? Next slide. Well, yesterday I talked about the different configurations. So in essence, in this tool, you need to make your decision about what are the 4, which one. So this tool that I am presenting today and this research is very practical. This is the intention to make you to having this decision. Next slide, please, Bob. And then other arguments. Well, the first one is to understand our limitations. And those limitations are defined by the public policy context. And I should say, and please, I don't pretend to create any dogma or cathedra at all, but I will say that colleagues working with technology this is my experience, maybe I am wrong, maybe you will correct me, but they are not very aware of the public policy context, and it's absolutely determinant on what you can do, basically. No, so this is our first point. The other argument is from a positive perspective, and it's our obligation to reduce risks, right? We need to reduce risk in the implementation for sure, no? But from the other side of the coin, the risk of a non-less bad implementation orientation might be unacceptable. And I want to share with you a case, okay? Let's assume that you are in a very decentralized public policy context, very decentralized. Very decentralized. So I'm going to ask you, Bob, if you don't mind, to go back to the slide where I have the four quadrants. Yes, it's perfect. Okay, let's assume that you are in the subsidiarity scenario. So you are in a country that is very delegated, and that you have a culture of documenting your requirements with very high level, okay? And you know what? You are just hired. I'm talking about a real case that I know. You are just hired, and then you are the new shiny portfolio manager in this top organization. Okay, and then you are, for example, coming from a vendor on databases, and you say, well, you know what, guys, I know the solution. The solution is to have a data warehouse. The solution is to have a central data warehouse where we have a logical data model with everything, and then you go for the integration implementation. So you select your public policy context is the subsidiarity scenario, and then you choose, because you have the power to say, I am going to through integration implementation orientation for my digital public service. So this is my problem. Well, this is my objective. Well, my message is you will fail, basically. It will be a guarantee fiasco. And I want to comment a comment. I cannot do many details, but in my experience in the private sector, unfortunately, I was in California. I was the portfolio manager in a major vendor. And then it was the terrible attacks of 2001, okay, in New York. Okay. Well, one of the things that did happen is one of the departments of the US, they came to us and they say, oh, guys, we need to integrate. We need to integrate all the databases, all the data warehouses of all the agencies. Do you think that they managed to get that? Well, the answer is I prefer not to respond for confidentiality. So let's go back to Bob, to my slide where I was next, and I just finished. So now I am open and coming back and giving you back the floor to you, Bob, for potential questions or tomatoes if my colleagues, they want to throw tomatoes to me.
Just a second, folks. I just Plan B was in action, but I've got to be careful that I'm on the right, doing the right thing, or else we'll just cut this entire thing off by accident. Okay. Change screens. Okay, great. Have we got any questions that are approved? I haven't had any approved. Has anybody got any questions with respect to the particular presentation? I'm just going to do a refresh here just to make sure. Oh, here we go. Just a second here. I'm just doing a refresh so that I can make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Okay, great. What we're going to do is take a look. Has the European Union interoperability reference architecture, behavioral and governance interoperability specifications, do they address security concerns, especially with the integration of the shared legal governance knowledge and platform?
The answer is yes, of course. We consider security in public administration a very important factor, and the way to address security, as many aspects, are with standards and specifications. So the answer is we provide some guidance on how to do that, but at the end of the day, how well or you implement that is a question of the implementation aspect. So yes, you can find, and actually, if I am not mistaken, in the latest version, we have a viewpoint, and we differentiated. This was as a consequence of GDPR, the privacy, and now because before in the previous versions we were mixing, and this was a very common error. We were having a single viewpoint for privacy and security, and since GDPR we have two, one for privacy and another for security.
No, I imagine privacy is probably a big one. Any other questions? I've got a question for you. Okay, when I looked at the business models essentially that you had in the slide, have you had any thought of using or reusing some of the MIT models from Jeannie Ross, basically talking about unified, coordinated, diversified, and replicated environments?
No,
Using that
I
as a
have
basis?
I have to admit that the answer is no, because one of the concerns that we have is on interoperability. Okay, I have to say so. Our fixation is on interoperability. Okay, so not only about integration or different models for integration, because again that's why I put the slide of differentiated between integration, coordination, and interoperability. So we need to understand that interoperability means a smooth exchange of information data between separated entities, correct? And sorry, yes.
No, actually, that model does accommodate that. Anyways, we can talk offline about that, this sort of thing, and
Sure.
over a beer or something. And well, when the lights go back on all over the world. Any other questions, folks? Okay. Well, Raul, thank you very much for coming to present to us. It's been a great pleasure. I'd like to digest this. We're going to put this, well, it's already been featured. We're looking at a place and we'll advise everybody in the conference where it's going to be posted. I think the interoperability reference architecture and the work that's coming out is going to be splendid and can be an inspiration and help to many other governments in the world. So thank you very much. With that, we'll end this session. Thank you very much, Dr. Abril. It's greatly appreciated. We're going to be going, and next session is going to be with Dr. Gregory Richards from the University of Ottawa. He's going to be talking about a lot of the research they've done on analytics-based results management. I would recommend this presentation. If anything, when you talk about evidence-based decision-making, this is what you basically need to have in place. Know what you're dealing with and whether you need to fix it or add new stuff to it. It's key in digital transformation, knowing not only where you want to go, but where you are, what's worked in the previous increments, and how you're going to fix it in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to end this session in about 15 seconds. First, we have to have 15 seconds of silence so the latency and the ending in the stream doesn't go awry.